What's the special laning this Shabbos?
Mishpatim.
That's the regular, right? The regular parasha is Mishpatim, but there's a special reading as well. Shkalim, right? This is the beginning of the 4 special parashas that we read between now and Pesach. So that's enough to scare anybody when they hear that Pesach is coming. There are 4 special parashas that we read over the span of almost between 6 and 7 weeks. So this week is Shekalim. What's Shekalim about?
Money.
Money. What money?
Shekels.
The half shekel. This is the story of the half shekel. So let's go back and first just remind ourselves what the half shekel was, when it was collected, who had to contribute, what it was used for. Let's just look at those things, because then we're going to discover that there's something very paradoxical about the half shekel. So initially it sounds like it's a very simple thing. It's a tax, basically, that was imposed on the Jewish community once a year. But like I say, there's something very paradoxical about how how the half shekel worked. So, what's a shekel to start with in ancient times? What's a shekel? It's a
Piece of silver.
silver. It's a piece of silver. It's actually a weight, because unlike today, where currencies are not directly related to the unit of currency, in those days it was worth its weight in, well, in this case, in silver. So a shekel was a certain amount of silver, and a half a shekel was obviously half of that amount. And then they would mint that into a coin. So the shekel was a coin that had 1 shekel's worth of silver, and the half shekel, as the Torah tells us, was half of that amount, which means a full shekel equals 20 geirah. Geirah was like a much smaller unit of measure, and so therefore, by implication, a half shekel is 10 geirah. Okay, and we're not going to focus on that in this conversation, but there is quite a lot of insight into why that number, why it's 10 geirah is half a shekel, 20 geirah is a full shekel, but that's not what we're going to focus on now. The half shekel originally appears in the desert. Anybody remember when? When was the first time they collected a half a shekel? The first time, and this is what we're going to read in the special reading this week, was part of the project to build the Mishkan, the original tabernacle in the desert. And at that point, they actually had to each give 3 half shekels. One of those half shekels was used to melt down and to create the silver that were going to sit at the bases of the walls that were going to form the main structure of the Mishkan. Half shekel was used as a census, and half a shekel was used for the running of the Mishkan. So that was the tradition, that was the origin of giving the half shekel. And then it became an annual tax that you had to pay when? Rosh Chodesh Adar. That's why we read the parasha this week, because this week is going to be Shabbos Mevorchim. We're blessing the month of Adar. The month of Adar is when they had the annual collection of the half a shekel. And so therefore, in anticipation of the month of Adar, we read the story of the half shekel. Every single year, they'd send out tax collectors, and everybody had to contribute their half shekel. And the Torah tells us, it didn't matter how wealthy you were, it didn't matter how difficult a person's financial circumstances. Very similar language to the mon that we were talking about 2 weeks ago. Very similar language. The person who is wealthy couldn't add more than half a shekel, and the person who was impoverished couldn't give less than half a shekel. It had to be a standard contribution right across the whole Jewish nation. What was that half shekel used for? So they would collect it. In fact, the Mishnah tells us that it was a very interesting collection system, where they had tzedakah boxes in the Beis Hamikdash. So either you gave it to the collector or you gave it personally in the Beis Hamikdash. Wherever it eventually landed up in the same place. So they had very unusual tzedakah boxes that were shaped like a shofar, which meant it had a narrow opening at the top and then a wide collection place at the bottom. And the idea was that nobody could stick their hand in to take out a coin. Once the coins were in. Security feature of the coin collections, right? What?
So they were concerned about that.
Of course they're concerned about that. That's human nature, right? Sure. So that's what they used to do. That half shekel that was collected, it was used first and foremost to fund the communal sacrifices that were brought through the course of the year. So the communal sacrifices was every morning there was the Tamid offering that was brought as the first sacrifice of the day. Every afternoon there was a Tamid offering that was brought as the concluding sacrifice of the day. That was brought on behalf of the entire community, was funded from this collection of the half shekels. Likewise, on special dates, Rosh Chodesh, Shabbos, Yom Tov, when there were Musaf offerings that had to be brought, again on behalf of the community, funded by this money from the half shekel. Okay, and then there's a whole discussion what they did with the excess, and so on. But the primary thing that it's used is for the communal sacrifices. Okay, every single year. So far, so good. Yeah, sounds like a fairly straightforward exercise. You've got X amount of people, you collect the half shekels, now you've got your budget to be able to run the Beis HaMikdash. Sounds very straightforward. Let's pick up something about the half shekel that immediately seems unusual. Okay? So, obviously the half shekel is now associated with the service in the temple, so you would assume that it should follow similar rules to other things that are associated with the temple process. So let's think for a moment, what other elements are there to the service in the Beis HaMikdash? And especially because we've spoken about what the money was used for, that should also lend itself to this conversation about what else happens in the Beis HaMikdash. So let's talk about it. What else do you have? What are the procedures that happen in the Beis HaMikdash? Who are the people who work in the Beis HaMikdash? What is the nature of the items of the Beis HaMikdash? We want to build some kind of a common theme that runs through all of them. So let's piece it together bit by bit. What happens in the Beis HaMikdash? What's the primary thing that happens in the Beis HaMikdash? Sacrifices. Great. Who are the people who run the service in the Beis HaMikdash? Kohanim, right? Okay. And what else is involved besides the animal of the sacrifice and the person who's bringing the sacrifice? What other elements are in the system in order to run the Beis HaMikdash, in order to run the service in the Beis HaMikdash?
Wood, fire.
Okay, there's obviously wood that has to go onto the altar. There's an altar, right? In order to have sacrifice, there's got to be an altar. Okay? And what else is there besides the actual altar and the elements related to the altar, like you've said, the wood, etc.? There are different utensils that have to be used for various things. So there's a utensil that you need in order to wash the Kohanim's hands and feet before they begin, and there are utensils that have to be used in order to transport the blood that had to be sprinkled, and there are utensils that are used to carry the spices of the ketores and the flour of the flour offerings. So essentially you could say there are three areas of operation within the Beis HaMikdash. There's the people, there are the animals that are to be sacrificed, and there are the pieces of the Beis HaMikdash, whether they are as large as the Mizbech, the altar itself, or whether they are as small as the little containers that were used to transport or to in some cases to sacrifice, like the ketores you had to use in a container, you had to burn it in a container, etc. What do they all have in common? Now this is difficult because they're very different. They're all very different things. What do they all have in common? The people, the animals, and the elements of the Beis HaMikdash. They all have something in common. What do they have in common? Okay, it might be difficult to guess what it is, but the second you hear what it is, it's like, oh, of course, that makes perfect sense. So I think the easiest place to start this conversation is let's talk about the animals that were used as sacrifices, start from there, and develop our common thread that runs through everything. In order for an animal to qualify as a sacrifice, what has to happen?
It's got to be unblemished.
Exactly. The animal has to be what the Torah calls tamim. Tamim means that it is of perfect health. So therefore, there's a long list of blemishes. If the animal has any of those blemishes, which could be as minor as a nick on its eyelid or its lip, so if it has any of those blemishes, it is disqualified, cannot be brought as an animal, as a sacrifice. What does that tell you? That in order to participate in the service in the Beis HaMikdash, what has to happen is you have to be complete, right? So the animal has to be complete. Is that fair? Good. So now let's translate that thread into a common thread right across all of the elements that are associated with service in the Beis HaMikdash. Where else do you see a similar requirement? The Kohen himself. If a Kohen has a blemish, if it's a permanent blemish, he can never serve as a Kohen. So many of us would be disqualified to be Kohanim because short-sightedness is one of those blemishes. So that's it. Whole bunch of us, thankfully, are not Kohanim because we'd be the guys sitting checking the branches of wood that they don't have worms, because you can't do full service if you have a blemish. And if a Kohen has a temporary blemish, for example, he's hurt himself and he's got a limp, then until the blemish has healed, he's not allowed to serve. In other words, the same principle applies. If you want to be in Hashem's home, if you want to be on his staff, you have to be whole, right? Same thing. Okay, good. Let's talk for a moment about the altar, the Mizbeach itself. Where do you see the common thread with regards to the altar? The Mizbeach has to be whole. If a stone of the Mizbeach gets chipped, the Mizbeach is disqualified. You have to replace it now with a full stone in order for it to be acceptable. The same, by the way, applies to the floor. If there's a floor tile on the Beis HaMikdash that is loose, and a Kohen stands on the loose floor tile while doing one element of the service, that element of the service is disqualified. Not only that, the wood that they used on the altar, obviously there's no such thing as a whole piece of wood. Every piece of wood is in some way knotted and gnarled. But if it is rotten in any way, it's disqualified. You cannot put something which is less than whole in its own context into the procedures of the Beis HaMikdash. And all of the elements that we use, the utensils that were used in the Beis HaMikdash, what are called the klei shores, the vessels of service, in order for them to be consecrated into service in the first place, A, they had to be whole, so they couldn't be cracked or chipped or anything like that. B, much more interesting, they actually had to be full at the time they were consecrated into service. So you could not consecrate an empty vessel. What does that tell you? Everything about the Beis HaMikdash and in its predecessor, the Mishkan, everything has to be in its most whole form, right? That's clearly the theme right across the board. It applies to animals, the people, and all of the utensils that are associated with the service in the Beis HaMikdash. Now, why do you think that is? Why do you think there is that insistence that everything has to be whole? Because this is Hashem's environment. And Hashem is obviously perfect. There can be no lack, God forbid, in Hashem. So by extension, anything that is associated with his home and with the service in his home equally has to be perfect, has to be whole, has to be without lack, without blemish, without pieces missing. Which makes you then wonder, why is it that the annual contribution that everybody had to make, of course there were many contributions you could make during the course of the year. You could donate anything you wanted to the Beis HaMikdash, either something that could be directly used, like gold and silver, or something that the Beis HaMikdash treasury could sell and use the funds in order to run the Beis HaMikdash. You could donate an animal to be a sacrifice. You could donate multiple times during the course of the year. But the main annual tax to contribute to the communal sacrifices, which effectively is the spine of the Beis HaMikdash. This is the primary focus of the whole service in the Beis HaMikdash. What do you donate? Half a shekel. It's different to anything else in the system. Everything else in the system has to specifically be whole and perfect. And yet the money that runs the system is deliberately chosen to be half. That's weird. That's strange. In a world of completion, we're contributing fractions. It doesn't seem to make sense. So that's the big question that we're going to have to explore about this half a shekel. Why is it, in fact, half a shekel? Now, let me ask you something. Do we do the half shekel today? We do a symbolic, we have a minhag, it's a custom, it has no real halachic import, but we have a custom that has been in play for centuries, that we do a symbolic half shekel donation just before Purim. So if you come for mincha on the fast of Esther, going into Purim, then at mincha, or just before mincha, our tradition is to donate the equivalent of a half shekel. So what we do, why do we lift the coin up? What do we do? So we get coins. No, that's on Erev Yom Kippur. So we get coins that are half denomination coins, and they have to be silver. So what we typically use is we get silver half dollars. So it's silver, which relates back to the original half shekel or shekel, which was a silver thing. And it's in a half denomination. And we had to do 3 of them to represent the fact that originally there were 3 different half shekel taxes. So we want to symbolically represent that. And we purchase those half dollars by putting down money to their value, then lifting up those dollars, they become ours, and then contributing them. So we've symbolically given the half shekel. Why is it that we do a half dollar? Why don't we just do the monetary value of half a shekel? Work out whatever silver is worth today. Work out whatever the weight of a shekel was, and then, essentially just give that equivalent to tzedakah. Why do we dafka have the half denomination? And a dollar has nothing to do with a shekel, other than the fact that it's silver and it's a coin. But in terms of actual currency, it's a totally different currency. Why? Because the Rambam tells us very clearly that throughout the generations, the way that the contribution of the half shekel will work is it will always have to be a half denomination of a coin. So not only is it that once upon a time they gave a half shekel, there is clearly something about this thing that has to be a half. That even in the generations, even when we're doing it symbolically, even when it's not going to the temple, it's still a half denomination, which is very odd, because everything else about the Beis Hamikdash has to be whole. Why here is there such a strong emphasis on the fact that it is not whole? Okay, good question. But I said it was going to be a paradox, not just a question. So now we've got to find the paradox of this. I'd like to ask you, and I'm obviously coming from a very biased position. If I approach you and say, would you make a donation to the shul? And you say yes. So let's say that the donation that you decided you're going to make is 18,000 rand, right? 18,000 rand you're going to make to the shul. From my perspective, how would I like you to pay it? As the collector. Right? One shot. From your perspective, perhaps you want to stagger it over the course of the year and pay a monthly installment. My question to you is this: is it more or less tzedakah if you pay it over the year?
More. Sorry.
Okay, so there is an argument. There's an argument to say that the action of tzedakah is a mitzvah every time you do it, and so theoretically, then, if you give it in multiple deposits, you've actually done the mitzvah multiple times. From the perspective of the people running the institution that you're donating to, it might create cash flow problems. That's a different discussion, right? But what I mean is,
if you do a mitzvah, you say, I'm making a donation of X amount. That's the mitzvah. Then you could break it up.
So it's a good question. It's a good question. If the mitzvah is the giving, not the pledging. So I'm not suggesting that it's better to delay. I'm coming from a completely different angle, which is it does not in any way undermine the donation if it is split. In other words, if I stated an amount and then I don't give that amount in one shot, it doesn't in any way undermine the value of the amount that I'm actually giving in the end. Okay? So what does that tell you? That incremental mitzvahs are still mitzvahs. I'll give you another example. Okay, so that was a financial example which directly related to what we're talking about. But just another example to illustrate the same point. If a person says that I'm going to learn a particular book of the Gemara, nobody has the expectation that you're going to sit down from beginning to end and not move out of your seat until you've completed the Gemara. We all understand that you're going to do it over the course of time, because it's completely acceptable and it's very normal that a mitzvah obligation can be, under the circumstances, discharged over a period of time. Obviously, there are some mitzvahs that can never apply to. So, for example, a person can't say that they're going to, instead of eating the required amount of matzah at the Seder night, they're going to spread that required amount of matzah over the week of Pesach. That's not going to work. But conceptually, a mitzvah could be done over a period of time, except for the half shekel. Because when it comes to the half shekel, there the halacha is very clear that you have to pay your half shekel donation in one shot. In other words, we don't know, reading the Torah, whether the half shekel has to be the actual coin of a half shekel or whether it has to be the value of the coin of a half shekel. Many people would think, listen, I'll donate the amount, but I'm going to do it in monthly installments or even in 3 installments or whatever the case is. So the Torah tells, the halacha tells us that when it comes to the half shekel, that is not an option. The half shekel has to be all given in one shot. Do you see the paradox now? On the one hand, this is the only part of the entire process and service in the Beis HaMikdash that does not have to be whole. In fact, to the contrary, it is deliberately chosen to be a fraction rather than a whole amount. And yet, it is the only part of the system that we insist has to be donated in one whole donation, which seems completely paradoxical. So it's piecemeal and whole all at once.
Rabbi, sorry, excuse me. The one half shekel I could understand. The one that they use for census.
For census, of course.
Okay.
Of course.
At the end of the day, it's still going into the Beis HaMikdash.
Correct, but if it's for a census, you can't stagger it, obviously.
And the other, what were the other? The one is for the running.
So again, in the Mishkan, one was for the bases. They actually melted the silver and they made the bases for
so
the.
That also you can't give half. You can't. I mean,
Sure, you could.
You can't, half a building, or the building will fall down.
No, but you could have. They could have collected it over time until they had enough, and then they could have made the silver.
They would still be
That-
building it today.
But the point is, we're talking about the one that's annual. The annual one is going to
that's
the
one I
to the
can
daily
understand. One I can
sacrifices.
understand.
The daily sacrifices over the course of the whole year. There really is technically no issue if the money is paid in installments because you'll still be able to run. So that's what we want to explore. We want to explore this paradox that on the one hand, this is a mitzvah that is presented as half rather than whole, and yet, so if I'm talking about the item itself is a half an item, yet the action of giving it has to be a singular whole action. So why that paradox when it comes to the half shekel? That's what we're going to explore.